Welcome back. It is 15 past 2 o'clock Eastern Time, so we'll get started. Welcome to our closing session on top trends for the future of education, a path forward and equitable futures. I'm Susan Patrick, CEO of Aurora, and I'm honored to be joined by 3 Aurora Institute board members. Next slide, please. First, I'd like to introduce Virgel Hammonds, the Chief Learning Officer at KnowledgeWorks. They're doing so much great work with states, North Dakota, South Carolina, districts, and communities all across the country for personalized competency-based education. You might know that Virgil was the former superintendent of RSU2 in Maine, a competency-based district, and a former high school principal of Lindsay Unified. He led our board DEI committee and now is the incoming chair of the Aurora Institute board. Next, I'd like to introduce Felicia Cumings-Smith. Felicia is the Senior Director of US Regions at National Geographic and the former Assistant Superintendent of Jefferson County Public Schools in Louisville, the 26th largest urban district in the country. Prior, Felicia was Senior Program Officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and she developed, implemented their principal and teacher leadership strategy. She's got strong policy background too, as the former Associate Commissioner at the Kentucky Department of Education. Felicia is the incoming Secretary of the Aurora Institute Board. Nick Donohue is the President and CEO of the Nellie May Education Foundation. He's the former Commissioner of New Hampshire and led the work to go to competency-based education as commissioner. Nick is the current chair of the Aurora Institute Board of Directors. So today we're going to examine trends and get clearer on the future direction. Let me start by just summarizing some of the themes and top trends we've heard over the last 3 days. I also turn to the audience for all of you participating to please put in the chat who you are, where you're from, but lift up some of the key themes that have resonated with you driving the future of education. So clearly we've been talking about student-centered learning, being culturally responsive for students, who they are, customized on how they learn best, and personalized, tailored to their goals, hopes, and dreams. We had an amazing student panel this morning. All of this, we've heard about how important it is to build on competency-based learning systems to ensure all students get the supports they need to get to mastery and have agency over their learning pathways. This notion of student-centered learning, to get there, we heard powerful trends on number 1, focusing on systems change. We heard about the need for leapfrogging in times of crises, leapfrogging to remake education so that all young people can thrive. Number 2, we heard that new designs must be equity driven. Number 3, we heard a call to really re-examine purpose and ask if our education system is fit for purpose. What is the aim of the system? Number 4, we heard a clear call for collective action and community, unleashing the power of the collective, collaborating with communities, students, families to establish a new call for purpose, goals, and reciprocity. Number 5, this involves a call that we heard to redefine student success more broadly. Broader frameworks that include building knowledge and skills with empathy, problem solving, navigating through uncertainty, care for self, care for others, learning across difference, and love. These powerful, meaningful learning experiences will require us to take a deep dive into curriculum redesign for what kids need to know and be able to do, and to help them become the change makers and future makers for human flourishing. 6, we heard about learning ecosystems, creating local and regional learning ecosystems inside and outside of formal institutions. Along with this, we heard about aligning K-12, higher education, career tech ed, work-based learning, workforce pathways through personalized competency-based pathways. I'm almost done here. The last 3, building capacity to lead change, learning from each other, and leadership, which you heard in the bright spots. Modernizing the educator workforce is a theme that was lifted up, building capacity in the educator profession and diversifying the professional educating workforce. And last but not least, we heard a lot about power dynamics, A theme was seeding power and building agency and power for students and communities, disrupting the current structures that are inequitable and replacing them with equity-driven systems that serve all students. So there, I tried to provide that high-level overview of the last 3 days, and please add in the themes that you've heard also. So let me start by driving this conversation on Aurora's vision. Is about redesigning education so all youth can achieve success, contribute to their communities, and advance society. What are the key themes that you want to emphasize from your own experiences, and what do we need to be paying more attention to? Please just jump in.
I don't think anyone wanted to jump on each other's toes. Felicia, go ahead. I saw you were about to go ahead, please.
Thanks, Virgil. Thanks for this opportunity too, Susan. This is a really important topic and glad to be a part of this discussion. You know, one of the things that I have learned from my experience is really focusing in on listening to students and ensuring that students are at the center of this conversation around transformation of our systems. That's been a long held belief and practice here in Kentucky through our Kentucky education system. And I see that as gaining so much momentum as we continue to move forward. You know, today's youth have to be the problem solvers. They have to be able to be the individuals who create solutions for the many challenges that we face. And thinking about our current context, you know, I'm relying on our youth and young people to drive towards solutions that address equity and racial differences and challenges that we're all facing across the country and the world. And so, you know, situating students at the center has been a priority in my experience in the work that we've been driving here in Kentucky.
If I can add to that, actually, my commentary is directly aligned to what Felicia had to say, Susan. You know, oftentimes we, especially those represented here on the panel, we speak a lot about personalization and competency-based learning to help drive equity. And what we have noticed a theme that has been amplified as a result of that commitment and as a result of today's world is a refocus, or excuse me, a greater focus on justice and taking that personalization and competency commitment to really thinking differently about how we can dismantle barriers by starting with, to Felicia's point, the amplification of the voices of our youth to really drive new learning experiences, but perhaps learning experiences that can also have an impact on social justice within their particular context, within their own communities. Imagine if we had, and this is happening in communities across the country, where now learners are, because that agency and that voice has been nurtured in them and inspired in them to take what they are learning from the tremendous educators and learning communities that are supporting them, to drive that learning in meaningful ways, so they can leverage that impact within their community, supporting that social change that they aspire to inspire within themselves and within their community. And the beautiful part about that is you're starting to see educators across the country that are promoting those practices that value and honor our learners' strengths and their potential and those experiences, whether they happen in our schools or within our communities.
I would add one thing, sort of a broader global piece that I think complements or holds promise for what Felicia and Virgil put on the table. And it's the proposition that we are entering a time when we're gonna sort of come back to our senses. So Robert Putnam, who wrote Bowling Alone, has just written a new book where he wonders if this isn't like the Gilded Age and the end of the 1890s. That was followed by some pretty tight and individualistic and greedy times. But the progressive movement, public schools were reinforced and reinvented in the 1920s as a result of that kind of wake up coming out of our stupor of overindulgence and overabundance for few. So, economic cycles and social cycles are long. And I think we have a chance of moving into another post stage where we are valuing things like our collective future and our interest. I think that's only going to happen if the heat continues on the volume of the voices, those least heard and most harmed by our current system. The explosion of support around the Black Lives Matters work this last spring, it wasn't because of those horrible incidents and the murder of Black people. Those had been happening for a long time and they had been publicized. It was the public reaction to it that was different. So we have a chance of holding on to that right position around voice and privilege. And I think educators are coming back. I think, we've learned to appreciate frontline workers. In our past 10, 20 years, the military has gone through a complete reset in terms of how people view them. And I think educators are next. I think their time will come back, one of respect and position in communities that's more publicly acknowledged. And I think those things will help.
Susan, if I might add on to Nick's points, I think that in your themes earlier that you described around power dynamics, this is exactly what my colleagues are really referencing, and ensuring that those power dynamics have shifted with young people and youth at the forefront of these conversations has the potential and will lead to the change that I think we all in the symposium desire to see. So I'm so glad that Virgil and Nick raised that as well. But that theme of power dynamics and whose voice is heard and how young people and educators can come together with the community and for systems change and transformation.
Yeah, thank you. It reminds me too of the amazing video we had yesterday morning from the students from Prince George's County Flowers High School, that literally the title was "Wake Up Everybody." It was a call to action. It was a call to change. So as education leaders working collectively with other education leaders that are really driven to transform the system, we're tasked with disrupting the structures that are holding the inequities in place on the systems that we've inherited, and ensuring that each child has what they need to develop their full academic, personal, social capacity to thrive and to thrive towards human excellence. This is a higher notion than a lot of the conversations that we hear in the US when we're talking about accountability and metrics and adding a metric. I mean, this is a reset here. So how do we think about how we can systemically redesign education to scale inclusive design that is putting student voice at the heart of it, to be equitable and culturally responsive?
I can kickstart if the team allows here. I think you said it just very well there, Susan. There's the idea of leading with learners at the center, right, and having them at the actual design table when so often the invitation was never made, right? And as educators, I think a piece that oftentimes we can get stuck on is that we always have our kids in mind through our design process. But it's been incredible to just witness across the country learning communities who have invited learners to be a part of the design process, and just how much more rich that design process becomes, and how much more inclusive of backgrounds, of experiences that enables that design to flourish and thrive. But there was really a great example that when I hear you ask that question, that I pulled from the team at Remake Learning in Pittsburgh. They actually asked this question that really helped push some people's thoughts in terms of rethinking what educator roles and who our educators are. And the question they drove with was, what if each school had a director of relationships, right? Which kind of comes back to the whole idea of leading with the learner in mind, but having the learner at that table. And how does that change the design process? And then the other piece that came up in that conversation was the idea of enabling or inspiring culturally responsible or culturally responsive personalized learning, where we're not just personalizing learning for the sake of that commitment as educators, but we're being really truthful in honoring the experiences and the backgrounds and the interests of our learners. And then lastly, I think a big piece that we're seeing in terms of that redesign or that dismantling that you referenced. And this is a big lift that I'm grateful many states many regions and definitely many local systems are considering is that co-design of a shared accountability system. So imagine that though, it's a shared accountability system. So it's not something that's done to us, it's something that we are collectively holding ourselves accountable to, but also integrating the pieces that are meaningful to our context, to our cultures, to that which makes us who we are as a community.
I mean, I would add some of the levers. There's some near-term ones that I think are important. So, just very concretely, I think things that will, are things to really pay attention to are policies around teacher diversity, around rethinking accountability, the way that Virgil said, really providing incentives for community engagement. We have systems in place. They have powerful incentives in place. They don't amount to much in terms of encouraging change. That's okay. Change the incentives and change the power structure. So, Every Child Succeeds Act has very nascent beginning obligations around community engagement in that act. And some of us worked hard to get that insinuated to open up the conversation. You go further on that. You wouldn't even have to make it the sort of toxic, more repelling argument that some people who don't know the facts lean into, which is it's not about race. We're all the same. It's just about kids. Well, okay, then let's incentivize analysis community by community about who is performing and who's not performing. And then let's invite those people with disproportionate numbers to be part of the conversation around what the remedies are. And in that case, you would have rooms filled with people of color, young people of color, because race equity and inequity defines the difference in our systems today. So you don't even have to call it out as an issue at the start, but it emerges naturally when you look at where the problems are and where the privilege should be put. But none of that happens without some continuing change around our mindset. So I get a little bit like I'm the hammer, everything's a nail. And I think this mindset, beliefs, and values things is really everything for us. We have done research. We are stuck in an interesting tension in our country between individualism and competition and the idea that we have a great public institution called public education, which can improve our futures together as a community. And we have leaned way over into the individual competition side, and we need to move ourselves into the more equity and community-driven side. Equity is not a gift. It's not a piece of charity. It's an essential survival condition that we acknowledge that the desperate inequities that are in place in outcomes and in opportunity are going to lead to our demise as a country. So it's not just about being generous and kind to people who aren't getting as much. It's about our survival as a community. And I think we're poised to do that because of the issues of putting students at the center, of the voices that are coming forward today and tomorrow. I do think it's a generational process, but that shift in embracing public education as a public asset, not a private asset to be distributed by income, is a big threshold that we need to keep moving through. And it's going to take political and community leadership to get us there. Because without that, I think that the efforts to diversify and democratize won't ever be fulfilled, because it will be on top of a foundation of values and purpose that has gone too long uninspected.
I'd like to just add to what my colleagues have mentioned. I'm actually going to take a slight turn to the scale part of the statement and question that you asked, Susan. And, just in my experience, I have seen scale and spread happen from top down, bottom up, inside out, right? And pushing on the notion that everyone has a really clear goal and there's transparency around that. I think you hear that woven into what Virgil and Nick had also shared as well, but collective ownership, transparency, so that the voices and contributions that need to be made to the critical problems that we're trying to solve are clear and have a clear vision and sight of what we'd like to spread and scale and see as a different future for our work. The other thing I'll narrow down to, Virgil's comments made me think quite a bit around not only co-design in assessment and accountability purposes, but also in thinking about co-design for curricular decisions. Young people are bringing their thoughts and comments and ideas and beliefs into the classroom more and more. And so that curriculum needs to be co-designed and co-developed and relevant and meaningful for real-time aspects of their learning. And they don't separate themselves, right? Neither do educators. They don't separate themselves when they get into the school walls, or in this context, into virtual settings. And so I think it's so powerful for us to think about that co-design element in all of what we do in bringing our work to scale today.
Yeah, if I can, Susan, do I have a second to build on that? Felicia is spot on. I think there's, well, I'll just be blunt about it. I mean, we've been talking a lot about our learners, but who are right there with our learners all the time are our teachers. And let's get real about teachers here for a second in terms of scale and supporting the redesign of our systems. It just doesn't happen without our hero teachers. We're counting on them now more than ever, and that says a lot. And so just to reflect a little bit, I go back to some home roots with friends and family in Lindsay, California, and thinking about how they have rethought how they rethought the expansion and the modernization of their educator support and preparation programs, kind of totally rethinking how to support, to Nick's point, the mindsets, to Felicia's point, the curricular leadership that is necessary to lead with purpose, to put children at the front and the center and families at the front and the center of that design process. It's going to require us to think differently about how we support our teachers in their supports of their learners and their communities. And I'm grateful there are learning communities like Lindsay and others across the country that are rethinking that. In addition to higher ed, that teacher prep programs, principal prep, leadership programs are also finally starting to shift their mindsets to be much more learner-centered and human-centered, and thinking about how do you lead transformation? How do you support the efforts that are necessary to lead beyond second-order changes that we're so accustomed to doing in education? So truly grateful for those commitments at the local level and across the country.
Yeah.
If I could reference the co-design mandate and call, Felicia, thank you. Absolutely agree with that. You know, the voices of people, you know, on the one hand, you know, people talk about building the plane while you're flying it. So I wouldn't necessarily have only pilots and flight attendants build the plane while they're flying it, right? I'd like to have some engineers build the plane. So I'd like to have some people who are thinking about ed policy and teaching and learning, designing, but you would never redesign a plane without consulting the passengers and the crew, at least engaging them deeply as a user in a user design process. So yes to that. And let's call it out for what it is. Like, co-design is necessary because years ago, a significant organization in our country did a big survey in African American communities about education reform. And the findings weren't that positive. There was a theme of, you know, any invention that comes from outside our community is likely to be another effort to set us back again. So it wasn't just neutral. It was like, this is the ongoing conspiracy to design against our future as communities of color. So that was an interesting thing to see and observe, because as a progressive white person, I was like, oh, we're all working toward the positive thing. Let's work together. And I thought, here we are in a place where the suspicion runs so deep that at the front door, these propositions are being thought of as efforts to hinder progress of a huge class of people that have been the object of oppression in our nation historically. So that's a condition to get through and get to the other side of.
Yeah. I mean, I just want to lift up policy, practice, mindset, culture. These are all like really critical areas to address. But I want to go back to Javier Guzman and his talk yesterday morning when he was sharing, and this is back to the scale question and the work that he's done. They started with communities of practice locally that were looking at change. And in 2020, they changed those to communities of justice. And they changed those to communities of justice with a community, with students. And I think that's a powerful idea when we think about building the learning ecosystems that are locally and regionally, and putting this pressure up on policy and across and through on practice with co-design, will require deep work on mindset and culture. I just want to give a shout out to DC Public Schools, who had an awesome session on equity driven human-centered design, and they shared a bunch of open resources that on the work that they're doing that really gets just practical examples. This is happening right now in pockets. We need an uprising. We need for this questioning of why and purpose and culture and how we do our work across the country. So kind of want to shift into action steps. These are big, complex systems that we're talking about. So how do we think of sequencing transitions that need to change? How do we think about action steps critical for transformation?
I can go, I'll go. I'll start off this one. I think about, all right, so the long haul is really powerful, creative, continually improving, equitable educational opportunities and outcomes, right? So we're in a nirvana state of, you know, an ongoing, ever improving approach that is increasing outcomes for everybody, but really accounting for the enormous gaps we have. So in order to get there, you're going to have to back map significant different practices. Like you said, you're going to have to back into policies. You're going to have to precede that with initiating policies that'll really open up the conversation. So education in the US is one of the few industries that really doesn't have a commitment to continuous improvement. And that's because we've accepted it for the culling and sorting machine it is, I think. That's one thesis. So opening up that conversation begins with a deliberation around purpose. If that conversation is held with the same people who have it today, it's going to reinvent a white dominant culture of education. So for me, the beginning steps are about the relationships we have and the way we approach this task. So I would say that it is about relationship building in this community first, that bridging the unspoken gaps still between the members of color, richer, poor, more affluent white participants who are on the right side of this effort. So if you do not have authentic, close relationships with people who we're talking about, whose futures we have in mind, especially if you're a white person, a practitioner, a leader, administrator, start building those relationships. That's my call to action. Get closer to people who are experiencing this. Think about where you live and where you commute and where you eat and where you shop. So that's a big lift. But I think that relationship piece starts the process. And I think a soon to be next step is really organizing around elected office. That we're talking about school board elections, civic elections, and community elections, because the democratic process is kind of messed up, but it functions in terms of approving budgets and passing ordinances and making policy. So building relationships and getting into the electoral sphere and being part of the power system feels like they are near-term requirements. And you notice I'm not saying experiment with a lot of new things and build up a proof practice point. I think that's important, but none of that is going to make a hill of difference if we don't change who's making decisions around educational policy.
You know, I want to add on to what Nick has identified as some short-term immediate actions. I actually saw that happen in my own state, right? In one of the districts, I saw church and local leaders really take back ownership of what was happening to Black and brown children in the community.
Yep.
And because those leaders of the church had become so involved in the community, one of those individuals became a board member of a local school district and really began to push on some of the policies that was occurring and in place and disrupting those policies based on some of the things that he and his church had really began to focus on for Black males in their community. The thing that I think about more than anything is really doing that landscape. You know, as an associate commissioner at the Department of Education, one of very few minority individuals at that level. The first thing I wanted to do was do a landscape of the policies that we had in place that might be a barrier for Black and brown children in the state. And so we did a full-on review and just determined how those policies were actually translating into action And then what I began to do as a leader was look to see what I could learn as a policymaker from what was happening on the ground. So I began to marry what I knew was in statute and regulation with what I saw happening in pockets of innovation for the benefit of students who are typically marginalized in Black and Brown communities, which is rare in Kentucky. But yet I was able to identify, what are some of those innovative practices that are happening, and how could I then take a stand on disrupting some of those policies that were currently in place and beginning to make smarter policies and put those smarter policies and practices in place. That began to drive some momentum in our state, and I've seen it happen in other state agencies as well. Oftentimes people say that state agencies can't be innovative, and I would actually challenge that. If you take this type of approach, learn from what's happening on the ground to develop smart policy, and that adds to building the relationships that Nick really spoke to as well, and knowing what's happening in communities.
I so appreciate your commentary, Felicia and Nick. I think it's just gonna wear my teacher hat for a little bit and say thank you for sharing those pieces. And I'll also say that if we're going to create the conditions for those comments to exist, we're going to have to start by setting those same conditions for those ideas and those principles to come to fruition. We have to start that with our own children and within our own classrooms. Because the reality is, if our children, especially our Black and Brown children, are going to lead and take ownership of their communities and support the transformation of their communities, that's going to take, we're going to have to create the conditions for those opportunities to exist within our learning infrastructure. So how do we create those, how do we create that ownership, that agency to exist in our own classrooms, so that in turn, as our learners continue to grow and advance in our communities, they can take those learnings from, again, our heroic teachers that gave them those opportunities to amplify their voices and to dive deeply into their interests, so that in turn, as they grow and become those leaders of our communities, we can seek those opportunities to become those electoral leaders, to become those policymakers, to become those entrepreneurs that we know our children can become, which really brings back to this whole idea that personalization is much more than a pedagogy. It really is an equity lever, and now more than ever, it's a social justice priority, for the very reasons that Felicia, you and Nick, you shared.
I know I'm watching time too, and I want to make sure that we have a chance at the end to give everybody a moment for closing comments. But I'm wondering, for the hundreds of people that have been involved with Aurora Institute, thousands over weeks, as we've been having this conversation, for our network, for I would call them the coalition of the willing, the open, what's the call to action for each person, depending on where they sit? And what their role is on this change? Like, what are we calling for each to do now and their role in this change?
I think I'm still off mute, Susan, so I'll keep going here. I appreciate the question, because I think it's not just the coalition of the willing that are a part of the Aurora Institute network. They're the coalition of the doing, right? They're in it right now. Sleeves are rolled, they're eyeball deep. They're stressed, and I think it's the call to action right now is to take their experiences, the great experiences that they are leading, and change the narratives of the purpose of what our schools are supposed to be. Create new solutions that drive the inspiration that they have shared throughout the symposium and in their day-to-day lives. And I think the other big piece is to question the assumptions about the purpose of school. More than ever now, we should be questioning, because the reality is what we do in service of our learners will inspire the transformation that happens in the communities that they serve. And lastly, I'd say that a piece I always take away from the symposium, whether it's virtual or we're together under the same roof, is that I always feel this kind of motivation and this urgency to do it together, right? We're not in this by ourselves anymore. There's such great momentum in this country and across the globe to think differently about the purpose of school and of education. So how can we bring this together? How do we make this everyone's business, so that we're all lifting and turning together, as opposed to trying to redesign and invent in our own classrooms and in our own schools?
Yeah, I don't mind. Nick, do you mind if I hop in here
do.
to add a few comments? Okay, great. I think Virgil has hit it right on the head. I would say, we are in the business of educating, and yet we forget to educate our colleagues and peers around the amazing work that's going on. And so I would say, just focus on really capturing and codifying those practices and experiences that are really showing benefit and promise for young people, and share it broadly. Bring unlikely people together to share these stories more intentionally. And what I found in my experience is that people are going to be willing to listen. We just have to be proactive in sharing the practices and help create legislation to move this work forward. I see us as a community, assuming, like what Nick mentioned, that we're all in this together and people will just come along because it is the way we should be doing our work. And yet, that is not happening for the masses. And so it is incumbent on us to be intentional in knowledge capture and sharing that information and bringing unlikely partners to the table.
And I'll add a couple of quick things to this good list along the same lines. I think I mentioned building relationships and really unpacking and understanding and building empathy around what's really going on. I think a second piece is I encourage everybody on the call to self-initiate intentional focus on this with people who are close to you. So a lot of people are talking about the election now and talking about voting and the importance of voting. That's really good. Move those forward to book clubs around Debbie Irving's Waking Up White, or some inspections of use your social networks to actually build our muscles on having these kinds of conversations. Like the gratitude for the election, of course, is that everybody cares about elections now. So that's a gift that we get to carry forward. Use the energy around the issue of oppression and white supremacy and racism to elevate and exercise your muscles. Because the only way that's going to change is if folks on this call do that themselves and then move their energy and muscles into their professional circles. And I wouldn't recommend that the first time you crack this egg is with your, superintendent of schools who needs a awakening around race issues. Practice with people you care. And here's one easy thing. Let's start telling the truth. Let's tell the truth about what's really going on in communities. So I was blown away by a report that was, I think, a year ago, and it was a public impression report about education. I don't know if it was RAND or Parthenon. And it basically said that, there's like 30% of kids are getting ready for post-secondary in high school in our country, less than 30%. And those numbers are skewed dramatically in communities of color. Yet when you ask people who live in these communities, these same families, they'll tell you that they think 65 to 70% of students are being prepared adequately. So where does that leave me as a parent? If I think everything's going better for a large majority of people, then I'm saying the system looks okay. It's just me and mine who aren't doing well enough. So it reinforces and feeds this machine a false narrative of personal responsibility for system failure. So let's start talking to people as practitioners. We do a good job of kind of reminding them how important education is, but are people here really honest with the parents and the students about what their prospects are in the systems they're in today? Because there's a grand confusion about them being better than they are that's across the board and really doesn't make exceptions for socioeconomic or racial identity. And that's mind-boggling to me. So I think getting information that really a third of our students are getting prepared for the license for a positive future. It's not 2/3. And what does that look like in our community? So being honest with ourselves about results and giving people better information so they don't feed the misinformation of false narratives coming from different parts of our society.
There are some good points that have come out of being in this new context of learning, right? And I think it hits home to what Nick is saying and what Virgil are both saying about telling the truth about what's happening with young people. You know, we had to partner in the district where I was. We took a deliberate stance to partner in new and different ways with families and parents and guardians during this time because they were left at a loss. They thought their, child was at a certain point and then discovered that they weren't. And that discovery happened in every community across America. And I think that is what Nick is really driving home in his comments about telling the truth, then getting to action, get to work in collaborative relationships so that we can do better for young people and create a new future.
I just want to say it's also really important for all of us in nonprofits, in institutions, and systems to take a look in the mirror and do our own work on what it means for our work too, internally and externally. I know we're doing this at Aurora, and I'm grateful to have the leadership of a board that is fully supportive of the transformation and digging in on equity, diversity, and inclusion, and asking what it means for our mission and vision and work. And you will continue to see this push and evolve. I just want to give a shout out for the Felicia for codifying practices, and also for the work on policy. We've been working for years on helping, and Kentucky, when you were there, was the first state to set up innovation zones. Like, how do we give communities and systems room for innovation zones? But if we're going to get deep into policy, we have got to address the fundamental school finance formulas in this country, which are by design horribly inequitable. We have got to dig in on some of these root cause analysis and continue. I just ask everyone in the Aurora community doing the work, let us know where you are experiencing barriers in policies, but also in practices. We published more than 100 promising practices. We are committed to trying to help shine a light on what people can do so we can learn from each other all year round. We love this opportunity to come together once a year at our conference. But we want to continue this conversation throughout the year too. So this is an opportunity for some last thoughts to wrap up the Symposium 2020. Let me open it up. Nick?
Great. I'll go first. I would just say, great event. Very glad to be part of this family. Been a great honor to serve as board chair. And Virgil, glad that your leadership will be felt moving forward. And I would say, I think sometimes we treat this issue of moving forward in education as a technical exercise or an academic exercise, or the object of like an academic seminar and an opportunity to make something different. And I would encourage people to think about it as an organizing opportunity. It's about values, it's about purpose, it's about competition of ideas, and we are not winning that conversation right now. So think about it as organizers. You don't need to be an expert, but that again reinforces the idea of connecting with other people, being clear about what the situation is, sharing good information, and opening up the conversation to people so the voices can be heard. And if we act that way, then I have some confidence that our democracy and its renewal, which I think we'll face, will bring us forward to a new opportunity. But if we treat it like something we're waiting for someone else to do, or something that's going to just sort of happen because somebody passes a policy, I think those are false hopes, and we can do better than that. Our country's built on organizing, it's built on community, and I think those values are going to bring us forward to a new day in education, one we can all be proud of.
Wow, Nick. I don't know how to follow that other than to say, I just want to say thank you to, this entire community that's been focused on this work in your districts, working with young people, working with systems leaders, working with communities to be at the front end of the transformation that we want to see. In preparation for this panel discussion, the four of us were talking about, what's the vision that we want to see in 2050, right? And I remember saying, we are always thinking about it as if it is so far away. These changes need to occur now, and they need to occur with a sense of urgency, as similar to how we're all thinking about our democracy and voting as if our life depends on it, because there are so many young people who are not getting what they deserve from our education system today. And so, you know, I could have been a statistic as well as an African-American female. And this is really personal, and it's personal for all of us. And so it is important for us to think about this as action that can occur now. If we have to start small and begin to make the changes happen in our communities, and let's do it together.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for that, Felicia and Nick and Susan. You and team always do a phenomenal job of inspiring other learning communities and other educators to think differently about what is possible for our children. And again, the symposium did that this year, and truly appreciative of you and your efforts. So I think I'll just build my last piece aligns great, I think, with Felicia and Nick, is what we've learned in partnering with communities across the country is, and seeing also that that movement that Nick references, to disrupt with intention. It's a big thing, disrupt with an intention, right? We have to, and we are identifying new approaches that to learning that respect and address the realities experienced by our children of color and our community of color. And that window of opportunity now more than ever is now. The need for change has absolutely never been more pressing. You know, there was this really great question that was posed by a learning community that I share with you, is imagine if our learners could say, I see myself and all individuals as a valued and accepting contributor to my larger thriving community. What would it take for that to happen? Is what you are doing now, is what your learning community is approaching now. Could your learners, or are your learners on their way to being able to say that very comment? But the good news is those that are here, the coalition of the doing, the coalition of the willing, and those who want to learn more and how to come back, they're doing that now. And that's just so inspiring. And I look forward to serving with Felicia and Nick, the remainder of the Aurora Institute board, and Susan and team, and helping that momentum to continue and snowball in ways that will forever transform the opportunities for our children.
Thank you. What a beautiful closing. And it is truly an honor to serve with all of you. I feel like we have a collective. For all of you who have attended that are out there, you have a place, you have a home. Let's do this. Let's make it happen. We are dedicated. We are dedicated to this, and we deeply appreciate everything that you're doing. I just reflect back on all the work that's happened in the last 1 year, 3 years, 5 years. The field is moving, it is moving, but we have so much more to do. So let's do it. And just join me in thanking Virgil, Nick, Felicia for this closing keynote. To all of you, we love your feedback. We're gonna drop the evaluation for this last session in the chat box, and just give me a moment to say thank you again. Know that we have recorded all of these sessions across the entire symposium program, and we'll make it available to you and your communities. I really need to give gratitude to all of the Aurora staff that have worked tirelessly in a short period of time to make this a virtual event, especially Natalie Slocum, Dequindra Bertrand, Elliot Levine, Jessica Brisson, Alexis Chambers, Sherry Picaccio, Jim Benson. You are truly amazing, and the collective work and the common mission that we're doing. To Chris Liang Vergara and the team from Carol Fox and Associates, Nikki, Lauren, and Autumn, thank you. We appreciate you supporting us to go virtual too. Thank you to everyone. We're looking forward to a time when we can all reconnect again in person. If you just go to the last slide, we hope to see you together in Palm Springs, California next year for the symposium 2021, October 25th through 28th. So let me leave you with the charge in these difficult times to come together, to rise up, to find our allies and be the change maker the world needs, and lead with light, love, and resilience on behalf of all kids. Thank you. Thank you for your collective commitments and contributions. Go forth and rise up. Thank you.